Hi, it's Dr. Z. In this video, I will review classical conditioning. By the end of this video, you'll be able to explain the contribution of Ivan Pavlov in developing classical conditioning and identify key terms in the process of classical conditioning. Please feel free to pause the video at any time to take notes. How did you learn to ride a bike? Did you watch your older sibling or friend ride their bike first? Did you have a parent or a caregiver teach you? Did you fall and hurt yourself? Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that is acquired through experience. We do not learn to ride a bike the first time we get on it. In reality, we've watched others do it first, either seeing it on television or in person. It's only then do we get on the bike ourselves, we fall, we scrape our knee, and a parent or a friend guides us along until we can do it ourselves. In other words, we learn to ride a bicycle through experience. Learning is also a relatively permanent change, such that we do not usually forget how to do the skill later in life. For example, if we haven't ridden a bike in 10 years, well, we just need a refresher to pick up the skill again. Learning to ride a bicycle involves a complex interaction of conscious and unconscious processes. There are three main types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. This video will focus on classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was developed by Dr. Ivan Pavlov. What surprises many students is that Dr. Pavlov was not a psychologist. Rather, as illustrated in this drawing, Dr. Pavlov was a medical doctor from Russia. Pavlov was interested in how stomachs digest food and how we salivate in response to food. Sounds sexy, huh? Since it's hard to study humans in the way that he wanted to, he had to use dogs as his test subjects. This illustration shows how Pavlov had to build a contraption that would hold dogs steady for the experiment. Recall that Pavlov was interested in studying digestive reflexes and salivation. Therefore, Pavlov's experiment required that he cut a hole in the dog's cheek to stick a tube and then measure the dog's drool as it came out of the tube. I know, it's hard to hear. Pavlov would measure the drool after he presented the dogs with food. As part of his laboratory observation, however, he noticed something really weird. He noticed that the dogs would start drooling before they even saw the food. How could this be happening? Pavlov discovered classical conditioning by a happy accident. He realized that the dogs learned to associate the lab assistant, who wore a white lab coat, and the fact that they would be fed food. In turn, the dogs would start salivating when they saw the lab assistant in anticipation of the food. To test this observation, Pavlov then developed a study using a bell to test his theory. Pavlov's experiment involved using a bell, which the dogs had never heard or been exposed to before. He knew that, when presented with food, the dogs would have a natural reaction of salivation at the sight of the food. Then he paired the bell with the food. In other words, he rang the bell and then immediately gave the dogs their food. He repeated this association several times: bell food, bell food, bell food, until he thought the association between the two items was made. Now, my friends, this is where the fun begins. Pavlov then rang the bell again, but did not provide any food. Ringing the bell led the dogs to automatically start salivating when hearing the bell, even when there was no food present. Pavlov's experiment supported his theory that organisms learn by association, or learn by making connections between stimuli that occur closely together. Classical conditioning, in its simplest form, is learning by association. For example, what do you associate with the word cookies? For some people, the association may be chocolate chip cookies and a glass of milk. For others, the association could relate to computers, as cookies are those small, annoying files that websites put on your computer to store information about your browsing preferences. Classical conditioning occurs when an organism learns to associate stimuli with another, and then consequently can anticipate events. The word stimuli here are plural for stimulus. In psychology, stimulus is just a fancy word for a thing or an object that makes an organism, like a human or an animal, react in some way. Classical conditioning is sometimes referred to as Pavlovian conditioning. The process of classical conditioning can be described using certain terminology. Here's a big hint. Pavlov uses the term unconditioned to mean unlearned. Alternatively, the term conditioned means learned. Pavlov's experiment introduced the bell, which the dogs had never heard or been exposed to before. The bell is considered the neutral stimulus. Neutral means nothing or none. In other words, it is a stimulus that has no reaction to it. Pavlov then presented with food, which is considered the unconditioned stimulus. In other words, it is an object that is unlearned to the dogs. As a result of this unlearned stimulus, the dogs would have a natural reaction of salivation at the sight of the food. This natural or unlearned response is considered the unconditioned response. Pavlov then needed to create an association by pairing the bell with the food over and over and over again. After the association has been made, Pavlov rang the bell, but did not provide any food. At this stage of the process, ringing the bell is considered the conditioned stimulus, or the learned object that will lead to a learned response, which is the conditioned response. In his experiment, the conditioned response occurred when the dogs automatically salivated when hearing the bell, even though there was no food present. Pavlov was curious to see if he could modify the learned reaction of the dogs. Well, it turns out you can change conditioned responses. In classical conditioning, the initial period of learning is known as acquisition, or when an organism learns to associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. There are 4 additional processes to classical conditioning. I'm going to use a personal example here to illustrate how conditioned responses can be changed. Several years ago, I was in a car accident at a stoplight. Generalization occurs when an organism demonstrates the conditioned response to a stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. In other words, the person has the same learned reaction to any similar situation. So, my friends, what do you think happened for me? For several months afterward, I would get anxious at any stoplight, as shown here with photos of 4 different intersections. Within classical conditioning, the process of discrimination involves learning to respond differently to similar stimuli. In other words, the person begins to realize that the learned reaction should only occur at a specific time, location. For me, I eventually was no longer anxious at every stoplight. Instead, I got anxious only at the specific stoplight of the original accident, as illustrated here with a photo of a specific intersection. I was able to discriminate or differentiate between the original stoplight and other intersections. The process of extinction occurs when the conditioned response decreases as a result of the unconditioned stimulus, being no longer paired or associated with the conditioned stimulus. In other words, the person's learned reaction stops completely. With time, fortunately, I was no longer anxious at any stoplight. I had overcome my association of car accidents and stoplights. The process of spontaneous recovery happens when the previously extinguished conditioned response returns after a rest period. The word recovery means to restore or return to a former condition. Spontaneous is referring to something occurring suddenly. Well, in this case, the person's learned reaction, which had been extinguished for a period of time, returns suddenly. Spontaneous recovery usually occurs when the unconditioned stimulus is inadvertently paired or associated with the conditioned stimulus again. Unfortunately for me, my anxiety resumed when I witnessed a car accident while I was waiting at an intersection. The conditioned response did not last as long this time because I personally did not have the car accident. But I was still pretty anxious for about a week after witnessing the accident. In summary, Ivan Pavlov contributed to the field of psychology with the happy accident of how dogs associated a lab assistant with receiving food. His work laid the foundation for classical conditioning, which is learning by association.